Okay, morning everyone. Thank you for joining us for our penultimate show and tell of this phase of work. Hopefully there will be further phases. Over on the next slide, so this is just a link for the, as we've done for the last few, the questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, just post them there and we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. Just a quick recap. So why are we here? What are we doing? We are developing an alternative offering to local authorities for adminning planning applications, but the difference is we're taking a user-centered approach to that. So what does that mean? We've been doing lots of constant testing and user research with planning officers and managers to make sure that what we develop is fit for purpose and useful and doesn't add unnecessary burden to the work. What we've been doing, I mean, we've been going flat out since beginning of April. So this last sprint, people have taken the opportunity of the easing of lockdown restrictions to take a spot of leave and renew passports and stuff. However, we have still managed to ship more stories, including more user testing research, but building the manager's journey, plus a spike to explore planning portals data schema, and more smaller iterations and more development. Over on the next slide. So yeah, I will hand over to Michelle, I think.
Thanks, Jack. So this sprint, we've done more user testing, and we've tested with 5 users, and that was a mixture of planning officers and managers in Croydon, Southwark, Buckinghamshire and Greenwich councils. And we've tested both the assessment screens for an application for full householder planning permission, but we've also tested some kind of iterated screens and a couple of new features for the permitted development assessments as well. And this has brought us now to, we've had 39 testing sessions in total throughout beta. Because we're quite far into the project now, we aren't really going to be doing much more testing, but we've got a lot of insights and we will be using these and referring to them in our next sprint. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at was kind of maps. How can we provide maps to planning officers? So we know that they need a few different maps. So one thing that they definitely need is a site location plan. And this is literally just a map that shows the property on the street with kind of a red boundary line identifying that the application is for that specific property. However, officers do also look at other maps as well. So they often look at the council's GIS maps to identify constraints. So they will enter the address of the property. They will identify, for example, if it's in a flood zone, if there's a protected tree on the site, and maybe even if it's next to a heritage site. And something we've heard quite a lot is a lot of planning officers also just refer to Google Maps, particularly to Street View. And the intention of this really, I think, is just to provide more context so they can understand how the property currently is, how it looks now. It might be used to also kind of plan site visits as well. And it helps to give managers who don't go out onto a site visit a little bit more context for what they're looking at. We did, as we're working in a very agile way, we did kind of play around with what could be the most minimum we could provide, what could be the minimum viable product. So we added this kind of link that would allow a officer to be able to just literally click on it and it would open Google Maps, but the property would already be in there, so they wouldn't have to copy and paste the address. And I think this was kind of seen as helpful, but it's more of a nice to have. It's not crucial. What does really matter is being able to see that map with the actual site boundary clearly on it. So if we go to the next slide, please. So something that we need to figure out really is just what's the best way to show that. So on the left-hand side, you've got kind of two examples of site location plans as they look now and as they come through via planning portal. They will typically be PDF files. And again, you can see that clear red boundary around the property. And if we were to take applications from planning portal at one point in the future, we could easily just display that PDF just as we do with all of the PDF drawings. However, on the right-hand side, you can see how this might work with other types of products. So for example, we've been working very closely with another MHCLG funded project, which is RIPA, which stands for Reducing Invalid Planning Applications. And they're looking at how they can provide this site boundary data to us basically as data. So as a set of coordinates and a polygon. And the way they explained it, which I think makes it quite clear, is it's almost like a tracing paper. So they don't provide the whole map, but they will provide that kind of polygon that we can then display on top of a map in BoPS. So we're going to just be exploring what's the best way to do that. Next slide, please. So another thing that we have kind of tested and looked at a bit more this sprint is for permitted development, the main assessment screen that an officer sees. And this is where they review the application that's come through. So all of the questions and answers submitted by the applicants, and they use those and refer to the drawings, and they measure the drawings and make sure that what is displayed in the proposal drawings is within the requirements of permitted development policy. So if the policy is you can have an extension as long as it's no more than 6 meters, that's kind of what they're checking for. We've kind of simplified this screen in some ways. So we know that if an officer, for example, checks those drawings and realizes that it goes beyond what's allowed under permitted development and they want to refuse the application, they do have to provide a reason for that recommendation for refusal, because this will be displayed on the decision notice that applicants get. One, because applicants obviously want to know why it's been refused, but it can also be used for maybe appeals as well in the future. So we've just made that a little bit clearer about which information will go on the decision notice, but we've also added an extra comment box that separates it out a bit. So you've got stuff on the decision notice and any comments you want to supply to your manager. And the reason we've added this is because when we've done user testing, obviously we've been speaking with lots of different councils because we're trying to build a product that works across different councils. And they all have different processes. And some councils are kind of, just kind of interested in, does it meet the permitted development policy, yes or no? So is it over 6 meters, yes or no? But we have heard examples where planning managers want to see the exact dimensions on the plans. And the reason for that seems to be kind of more of a trust thing. So for them to be able to trust the recommendation that it doesn't meet permitted development requirements, they want to see, okay, it doesn't because it's 6.1 meters, not that it's just over 6 meters. So it is kind of like reassurance that the officer has actually checked the plans. But again, not all councils do this. So I think one thing we want to look at is how does this work in reality? How are people using it? Because we think we might be able to iterate it and make it even smarter in the future. But really, this is kind of something that we can get out now and start testing with people. Next slide, okay. And now I'm going to hand over to Claudia.
Thanks, Michelle. So this is about drawing numbers for permitted development. We knew that drawing numbers were required from legislation to document the plans on the decision notices. And so we're trying to ensure that all parties understand which documents have been approved or refused. So in the prototype on the left-hand side, what we've created is a list of all the drawings that are proposed. So we're automating that process, and then they can type in the drawing number. And if the drawing or the document has more than one drawing and more than one drawing number, they can press add drawing number and add another one. So it's able to be adapted depending on what the applicant submits. Back please. Thank you. And so once they go through that, if all of the drawings have one drawing number on them and they press submit, then it would be seen as complete in the task list. But if one drawing was missed or a document has been superseded after adding drawing numbers, then it's in progress and a recommendation cannot be made. So this is ensuring that all the documents are within the decision notice and none are missed off. With this process, we do understand that some teams do this process differently, and for full householders, we may need to expand which documents are added to decision notices. But we also know that in different councils, different people do this. So in some, it's the validation team, not the officers, whereas for other teams, the officers do it. So for the MVP, we are putting it within the officer's journey and we'll see how it goes. And we'll have to troubleshoot depending on if it's not working for all councils. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've been doing this sprint is focusing on how we scale the MVP to full householder. So last time we showed the first skeleton journey of that. And this time we've done a few iterations with the task list and a bit more details, and we've been able to test that. Next slide, please. So the first one is the officer making a recommendation. So I've pulled out just a few highlights of the testing and some of the changes we've already made. So when the officer is making a recommendation, this step occurs after they've made the assessment. And in version 10 of the prototype, they were given the question, based on your assessment, what do you recommend? And when showing that to officers, we got very similar feedback. One person says, I haven't seen all of this together yet. You can apply policy, but everything is a balance. If everything is slightly affected, but one is significant, I need to weigh that up and see if I can solve it with a condition. So from this feedback, we were able to see that it's not black and white, and like you can't just like have the assessment in your back of your mind. It can take some work to kind of process. So in the next prototype on version 11, what I did was I just added the assessment above and that same question is below, and they can use that to reflect. What I need to do more work on is think about the conditions and how does that come into play. So I'll probably be doing more prototyping on that. Next slide, please. Another thing that was interesting was document organization. So with permitted development, there's a lot less documents generally, and that was working fine. But once we showed it in full householder, we were able to see, based on what they were doing and what they were saying, that not everything was as intuitive, or what we weren't aligned or what we thought would be there. So in the first prototype, we had 3 tabs for documents: site visit, sitemap, application form, and proposal documents. And we noticed that often people would go in the proposal documents place to try to find different forms like the application form. So since that, on the new prototype, I've been changing the tabs. So proposal documents, that name is now proposal drawings because it's more representative of what they're going to expect. And then on this prototype specifically, I'm looking at how we can remove certain documentation. So I took away the application form and instead I added a material section. And so that could be able so that if they're in the assessing the design, they can then look and see the materials at a glance. And so this prototype is, if we have are working with a system that's more data driven, what would that look like? And I'll be continuing to take out documents and try different things with that prototype. And the next slide, please. Thank you. And with the application form, we got the feedback that this is only the first page of the application form. It was on a tab by itself. And this was because I was trying to follow patterns with the sitemap. But because it's only the first page, they didn't think it was like a thumbnail. They expected to be able to see the whole thing, and it's not very helpful. So to make that clearer, I now have a proposal documents tab that has multiple documents that act more like thumbnails. And this version of the prototype will be if we're more connecting with current systems that are more document-based, how can that play in? So right now I'm making 2 prototypes depending on what data we get from the systems for a full householder. So I'll hand over to Neil now.
So in this section of the show and tell, we're going to demonstrate some of the technical work that's been done this sprint. Echoing some of Jack's comments earlier in the presentation, we've had some reduced capacity on the development team this sprint. So we've got maybe fewer things to show this time compared to previously. Another reason for that is that we've been doing some sort of behind the scenes refactoring or code structure changes, especially to support the ability for officers to comment as they already can, but in an upcoming feature to give the ability for a manager to request corrections for the officer to sort of take on board as part of their reassessment process. So that's some of the behind the scenes changes that we've been doing. Yeah. So before I hand over to some of my colleagues, just to mention that we had a security assessment or penetration test done on the system, and we got the reports back this sprint, and we've been, they described 5 low and 1 minimal score issues. That's a scale from 1 to 5. So those are just in the first score 1 and 2 out of 5, and 5 being the highest impact. So we're in a good position. One of the examples of an issue that we need to remediate is access control to some resources that shouldn't be allowed for certain user roles. So we're going to perform these remediations before we go live with the system, and we'll resubmit the application to the pen testing company to do a shorter, more focused re-evaluation of the issues that they've pinpointed. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Evan Velostan.
Hello. This sprint, we also did a spike of one portal web service documentation, and what we found is that they have 3 different endpoints that return planning portal planning application data in XML data structure using SOAP, which operates 24 hours a day. As you can see, the 3 different endpoints are the following: the get proposal list, which it responds with the list of all the applications that have been submitted to them electronically through the planning portal. The second one is the get proposal, which you request details for a specific application, and it will return all the application form data in XML, including 4 PDFs. And in addition, it also supports the document files that applicant has attached. And the third endpoint is the set proposal received, which this will send acknowledgement of receipt of a specific application and changes to the planning application status from submitted to transfer. Now I will hand over to Melissa.
Thanks, Evangelos. All right, so I'm going to take you through the service demo of the things we've delivered in this sprint. So I'm already logged out as an assessor in this case. As we've mentioned before, we are currently working on the manager's journey. So the biggest focus in the sprint was the assessor journey. And what we wanted to do based on feedback was that when you log in as an assessor, you want to primarily see your own applications and the ones that haven't yet been assigned. But you can also have the option to toggle that view and see everything that your colleagues are also working on. So it just helps keep the focus into what you're already working on. The other thing we also did was within an application, we have moved the proposal documents over to the right-hand side. This was also based on feedback. We were told that we didn't want necessarily to have the proposal documents occupying the entire page, and that it's preferable to have a scroll bar, so that was more easily accessible and more useful to have them on this side. And that's it. Now over to our next steps.
Find my mute button. So yeah, next we have one sprint left, a fortnight left. So in that time, we will continue to build on the functionality, particularly around drawing numbers on decision notices. Again, we'll continue to iterate to allow officers to add their refusal, but why they're refusing or recommending why an application size being refused, but adding that to the decision notice, because obviously that will have an impact on whether on if an applicant decides to appeal that. And we've been working with the planning inspector as well, so we'll continue to iterate that. More spikes. So spikes are just a concentrated period of research and investigation, looking around opening drawings in Adobe, so officers can measure plans and drawings. This has come up quite a few times, and we appreciate that as it stands, having to download a drawing to open it up into another tool to measure it would be a backward step and just adding to the burden. So we'll be looking at how we can make that a more efficient process and being able to measure it directly in the system. But yeah, maps, as mentioned earlier on, we'll be doing some more investigation around how we can integrate maps, but also make them more interactive. That I think is for it for next steps. I think on the next, so just more detail about, we've got our own website where you can look at previous show and tells and sprint notes and get a better understanding of the context of the whole project. Quite a few blog posts now, and you can have a play around with the prototype. There's a link on there with username unbox password magic. So I think that's it for the show and tell. Michelle, are there any questions?
There aren't any questions at the moment, but if we just leave this on the screen for a little bit, because I know there is sometimes a little bit of lag on the live stream. However, it could also be that people have taken advantage and looked at the horrible weather and maybe got away. But if we don't get any questions, if anybody does want to post any questions later on, it's fine to still post them in the Slido, because we can always read them out at the next show and tell as well, if you ask them later on. Yeah, I don't think there are any questions coming through.
All right, I will send around another invitation for our final show and tell, which is same time in a fortnight, and we will demo the whole service, and that one should be even more exciting than the last 8, I think. If there are no questions, then I'll just say thanks very much to everyone for watching.